Open University.
The class Zeitgeist. It's one word, it sounds like two words. It's made up of the German words Zeit, which means time, Geist, which means spirit, so it's the spirit of the times. And today I want to think about whether it's possible to escape the spirit of the times, and whether especially it's possible simply by having an opinion which is against the spirit of the times, to be against the spirit of the times. This actually is something I first dealt with in a click opera entry called The Arrow and the Frame. And it was spurred by looking at how Google AdSense, which was the algorithm they used to pick up what people are talking about on web pages and then place appropriate advertising beside it, was actually somehow rather wise, in the sense that when it picked up fascists discussing terms like dimitude, these terms which are actually part of radical Islam, it would advertise, hijabs to them or whatever, simply because it mistook them for radical Islamists, or just Muslims in general, because they genned up on the terms. They said, well, our enemies actually want to enslave us, and so they appeared almost like the other side. And that's that is the nub of my thought. That set in train a whole process of thinking about to what extent we are able to what extent opinion, in other words, the arrow pointing in a particular direction. Let's say I'm looking at the Trump inauguration. I'm saying, well, hey, I'm going to post something on my timeline on Facebook about the Trump inauguration, about how I hate this shouldn't be happening, blah, blah, blah. But nevertheless, you're still on the same page with everybody else, and you're talking about the inauguration. There's probably a picture of Trump in your thing, which is annoying me, because I'm looking at my Facebook feed and I'm just seeing pictures of Trump, and I actually don't care whether you're pro or anti-Trump, really. What I care about is that I want to filter him out. I want to somehow live in a world where he's not happening, he doesn't exist. Of course, that's an impossible task. So I keep coming at this thought, which is really a very deep philosophical thought about the possibility of individuality. Is it possible to step off the page of history, to step out of the box? And actually, as I get older, I think it's less and less possible. Just the other night I was watching a documentary about Émile Cioran, I think it's pronounced Cioran, maybe the French would say. Was a Romanian writer, who in his fairly advanced years got fashionable in France as a pessimistic thinker, maybe a little bit in the mode of Céline, and very aphoristic, really beautiful, exquisitely polished little aphorisms. And then there was a scandal immediately after he died. There was this scandal about how he had been a Nazi, or how he had been sympathetic. He had gone to Berlin and Munich and other cities in the 30s and been very enthusiastic about Hitler, and written articles for his press back in Romania, for the press he wrote for, celebrating Hitler as a great man, a hero. So, this is supposed to have tarnished his reputation, just as it tarnished, say, Günter Grass's reputation, that he had been a member of the Hitler Youth, blah, blah, blah. This is often the case, that people in different eras, that the skeleton in the closet, in the case of these writers, is simply that they went through their era and didn't have sufficient... Well, is it even a question of not having sufficient, say, Marxist commitment, as Brecht did, or a few writers had very strong revulsion against Hitler and were obviously against Hitler right from the start, and Hitler was against them. So they were almost chased onto the correct side of history, what we see as the correct side of history. But is it even a question of having the right opinions? Because people, as we know, as we can see in history, the whole West German thing, post-war West Germany, it was populated by a lot of the same people who were the basic logistical mechanics of Nazism, but who simply renounced their opinions or covered up their opinions. History was able to allow them to Photoshop out their misdeeds as it appeared later. This is something I also thought about in that click opera essay in relation to the art series State of the Art, which Sandy Nairn made in the 1980s, and I was marveling at the fact that Sandy Nairn had got a lot of previously radical 60s artists renouncing in the 1980s their opinions and saying that now things appeared more complex to them. It wasn't just us and them anymore. The clever thing was to be an entryist. You had even Cindy Sherman saying, I've taken over some pages in Vogue magazine, and the interesting thing will be to subtly subvert Vogue from inside. This was the great logic of the 1980s. Let's get inside the system and we can be hippies or subversives, or, you know, we are still essentially of the left, or we're still radical bohemians or whatever it was from the 60s. But now we're inside the machine, we can do even more good. And of course they're simply eaten up.
I wanted to imitate something out of the culture and also making fun of the culture as I was doing it.
Not spat out, they actually become the machine, they become the new version of what the machine is. So I really question as I get older whether you can be against the spirit of the times. When I look back at the previous decades of my life, or David Bowie's life, he's my barometer for measuring what people are doing in any given decade. And David Bowie in the 90s is saying, hey, I'm an internet service provider. You know, this guy who's supposedly very original stands head and shoulders above everyone else and is ahead of everyone else. That's kind of different though, isn't it? Being ahead means being on the same page, but just being slightly in advance of other people. I think actually, in some ways, but no, I'll come back to that idea later. I think, I was going to say, I think in some ways we are, with Trump's inauguration, we're simply seeing an internet troll, the kind of internet bully that we saw in about 2007, 2008. We see that filtering down, because one process is that pioneers pioneer things. You know, we do things first in our little minority groups online, we test things out, and we see certain processes in their infancy that then, like widening ripples in a pond, spread out to more normal people, more mainstream people, slightly slower people, maybe, educationally and in terms of trends, because a lot of people spend a lot of time resisting trends or simply being ignorant of trends. So the internet bullying thing that we saw in, say, I think it peaked in 2007. We're seeing in 2017, 10 years later, we're seeing a president who's basically an internet troll, who's simply using his Twitter feed to try to govern the world by bullying people and using his lawyers as well. And now, apparently, executive orders to simply bully people, push them around and impose his ridiculous and provocative opinions. But I realized that as a sort of early adopter and a pioneer, I've spent a lot of my life championing ridiculous things, or things which seemed great at the time, but then 5 years or 10 years down the line seemed like the most banal thing in the world. Can you believe that at a certain moment in my life, I proudly took people to Pret-a-Manger? Pret-a-Manger, I used to live in Covent Garden, and I used to take people to the very first branch of Pret-a-Manger, which was on St. Martin's Lane, or just around the corner, on the corner of St. Martin's Lane and Long Acre. And I said, wow, this place is so cool because they have sushi. You know, pre-cut, pre-packed sushi. It's the first sandwich bar, essentially, that gave you sushi. Or, you know, for similar reasons, there's a place called Yo Sushi, a British sushi chain that uses conveyor belts that you get in these Japanese restaurants. And that seemed like the coolest thing in the world, until, of course, Pret-a-Manger and Yo Sushi become chains. There's a branch in Edinburgh and Glasgow and Perth, probably, you know, in the concourse of Victoria Station, blah, blah, blah. So the things that you set store by and in a sense you invested your identity in become the most banal things in the world. And you realize that you were simply idiotically caught up in a question of a lot of things that we early adopters do are incremental things, while there's been a little incremental shift. Another chain I championed earlier on was a thing which is now called Granif in Japan. It's a t-shirt chain where they use sort of Helvetica graphics and pseudo-German phrases on t-shirts. It was originally called Graphic, then it changed its name to Granif, and now there's a Granif. There are little pop-up Granifs in shopping centres and, you know, malls, and it's totally, they haven't changed their design very much. It's still this Helvetica thing. In the interim, of course, Helvetica has kind of changed its status. We're all a bit bored with Helvetica. There was Helvetica, the documentary, which came out in whatever it was, 2011, saying that, hey, Crate and Barrel uses Helvetica now, this is really cool. Of course, the moment you get a sort of high-profile documentary about a typeface, you know that it's going to go out of fashion. I was watching a talk that Peter Saville, the graphic designer, gave to the Architects Association in, I think about 5 years ago, and he was talking about how the thing not to do in 1978, when he started making factory posters for factory live events, which later became the record label, basically. The thing not to do was to refer to the 60s. The 60s were so out of fashion at that point that you absolutely would look for any other period, maybe the 1860s or the 1660s or something. You'd go back to Jan Chisold or the typographers of a great seriousness and classicism. So of course then the New Romantics adopt this. And can you imagine the New Romantics reviving the 60s? The New Romantics absolutely wanted to distance themselves from everything that the 60s represented. This was their version of punk's rejection of the past. And while we've seen fewer radical cultural turns like that, like punk, like New Romanticism, we've seen a cozying up of the generations, I think, in late neoliberalism, where kids and their parents both like David Bowie, or both, they're all into the same things, they wear the same jeans, the same clothes. There isn't really that sense of, oh yeah, dad does this, dad smokes a pipe and sits in an armchair, wears his slippers. Slippers are now trendy again, as you can see. I'm an early adopter of slippers. But this idea of whether you can actually swim against the tide, I think it's a question of freedom as well. How can you be free if everybody else is not free? Could I live in a little bubble? I notice this when I go cycling here in Japan. I actually go out on my bike and I notice that I don't feel right if everybody else is doing their, there's a lot of trucks around, garbage trucks, logistical things, people delivering packages everywhere. And it's not like I can just swan freely through a world which is free because other people are working. Sometimes that's a nice contrast. I like to be free when others are working, but not when it's just delivering packages and driving trucks around, which become a danger to me on my bicycle. So that's just a little example of how it's really hard to be off the page. It's really hard to be out of the box. It's really hard to be in some kind of bubble which is outside history. We're none of us outside history. Japan is an interesting place to live because it seems to be, from all sorts of objective measures, different from the rest of the world. It seems to be qualitatively different. And ironically, I sit inside a bubble in a bigger bubble. If Japan is the bubble in terms of things like longevity, gun crime, cancer rates, educational level, and the apparently low level of authoritarian populism so far, I live within the bubble of that bubble, which is that I'm actually very attuned to the West when I'm here and to what the West is doing. I feel very helpless about it. And what I do is I go back through the archaeological layers of past history and I look at how things were different. Imagine being in the early 1960s and it's the Cuban Missile Crisis. You're terrified for a start and you feel totally powerless. This is a historical development which is partly technologically biased. In a way you could say it's these things, certain things like, say, Nietzsche. The reason that Emil Cioran was a fascist in the 30s was that he associated Hitler with the Nietzschean superhero. I think we can safely say that. He was very influenced by Nietzsche. The fact is that we're all kind of doing the same things at the same time, and it almost doesn't matter how we feel about them. We're looking this year at when this wave of authoritarian populism will affect France and Holland and Italy, and of course there are different political contexts in each of those countries, and the French tend to all gang together at the last moment to prevent fascists actually gaining the presidency. But the fact is that these oppositions, these resistances to the Zeitgeist, tend to be pathetic as the CND marchers who simply said ban the bomb. Obviously, in a situation of mutually assured destruction, nobody was going to ban the bomb. But if you felt better about yourself if you were on the right side of opinion on that. Yes, the bomb is a terrible thing, it kills people, let's ban it. So it's I almost feel quite defeatist in terms of opinion, I don't think there is any opinion solution to the current fashion. I think it is fashion over opinion. I think Zeitgeist means that when there is a particular fashion for something which then comes to dominate the whole agenda, when something is growing, croissant, it's almost unresistible. And, as always a fresh thinker, and being influenced in this case by a guy called Eckhart Tolle, German, kind of new agey philosopher, believes in this philosophy of surrender. Don't invest emotional energy in something, because if you do, you will simply be inhabited by this thing. You'll be taken over entirely by it, and you'll spend a few years resisting it. He cites in his Year with Swollen Appendices diary Lisa Lyons, the bodybuilder, and saying that a lot of his friends think that's a horrible look, but he simply instantly accepts that women can have muscles and have that shape, and that's fine. Because he didn't invest emotional energy in resisting it, he's somehow freed from the phenomenon, although of course he simply signs up to it, says that, yeah, it's great, I like this new development. It reminds me of a John Cage parable, a Buddhist parable that Cage learned from D.T. Suzuki. And again, D.T. Suzuki, very interesting example of this. D.T. Suzuki influencing so many artists. When you look, and certainly not spotless politically himself either, when you look at his affiliations, but D.T. Suzuki spreading Zen Buddhist ideas through the art community in the US in the 1940s and 50s. That's a ripple that really spreads, and kind of unresistible in the same way. But D.T. Suzuki, anyway, told John Cage this anecdote about two Buddhist monks who come to a river, and there's a woman trying to cross, and one of the monks says, "Get up on my back and I'll carry you across the river." And about an hour later, the other monk says to the first monk, "Why did you take that? Why did you touch that woman? Why did you take her on your back and let her cross the river with us? You know we're not allowed to touch women." And the first monk says, "Put her down. I did 1 hour ago." So the idea is that by resisting things, you let them inhabit you even more forcefully. And this is what I worry about when I see my social media feeds full up with Donald Trump. Of course, I realize it's totally understandable, totally necessary. And yet, by simply giving someone like Trump, who absolutely loves the oxygen of publicity, you're doing everything he wants simply by talking about him. So I don't know if it's a solution, though, simply to ignore the zeitgeist, because I don't think it's possible. One slightly optimistic thing is that a lot of today's policies are dictated by stupid people. We know as the pioneers that we discovered these ideas, like how to bully and provoke people online 10 years ago, and that we get over it. It actually gets boring. So I think boredom is the great cause for hope. So people simply get bored with things, and that's why they go out of fashion. There's also the generational turnover, and also the sort of death is weirdly enough an optimistic thing, in that a lot of, say, Brexit has been dictated by old people, and that death will claim these old people pretty soon, and their ideas will go away. So the Brexit idea will, at some point, go out of fashion, because all the people who support it will be dead. So hey, look at the bright side.
Open University.